flexible is XML and how to define tags and ending tags. And apart from tags, we learned about attributes and advantages, disadvantages of XML. Those things we learned last week during our last session. So going forward, yes, we learned about these XML elements, attributes, and these things. Yes, give me a second. Right. So I hope you understood these basic things about XML, and I really hope that you went through this again after the lecture. Name spaces and these things, right? So anyhow, we stopped at this place, right? We learned about DTD. So I'll go through this DTD again because it is bit complex than what we learned till now. So now the main reason for the use of DTD is XML is too flexible, right? So many programs cannot understand what really is XML document because there is no proper standard for XML documents, right? So in order to establish some sort of vocabulary or some sort of standard for XML, we use this document type definitions or DTD, right? A document is valid with respect to a DTD, right? If it conforms the rules specified in that DTD, right? So what it says is, before defining the XML document, we have to define some sort of rules for that particular XML document. If the XML document is validated against the rules defined in that DTD, that is a valid XML document, right? So now you have to remember there is no standard for XML. So it is a very flexible language and sometimes it is too flexible. But in order to use it with programming languages and applications in our day-to-day use, we need to have some sort of standard or some sort of given set of rules. So since XML is too standard and it doesn't have any rules and regulations, what we have to do is we have to define the document type with DTD or document type definitions, right? Once this DTD is defined, we consider a particular XML document is a valid XML document only if the XML document conforms to the rules specified in that DTD, which is related to the document, right? And it says most XML parsers can be configured to validate. So, right, going forward, now this is a sample DTD. So, first here, we define the root node, right? We define a root node. Root node means the starting point of the document. So once the root node is defined, then we are going for next things, right? So here we have multiple elements, title, article, title, author, text, right? So here you can see in the article tag, in the article element, we have title, author, and text. That means this article element has another 3 sub-elements or can have another 3 sub-elements, right? So when it comes to validation of DTD or validations of XML document, if the elements that are included in article element is different than title, author, and text, it will return an error saying that this XML document is not valid because there is some undefined sub element in this particular element, right? So article in here in this first line it says article element can only have title, author, and text sub elements, nothing other than that. And then it says this title element can have PC data. PC data means past character data. That means simply characters, right? And author characters and text. This text element can have, then again, text element is a sub element of article element. As you can see, a text element is a sub element of article element, right? So this text element can have another set of elements called abstract, section, and literature, right? And then this abstract element can have PC data, right? And section can have PC data as well as a sub element called index, right? So going forward, content of the title element is past character data, PC data, right? Content of the article element is title element followed by one or more author elements. So you can see author plus here. Author plus means it can have one or more elements mentioning author. So as an example, now if this book is defining articles, right? Let's say articles of newspaper. This document, XML document, is defining articles of a newspaper. So usually a single article might have more than one author, right? But at least one author, but there can be more than one author. There can be 3 or 4 authors for a single article. So in that case, it says author plus. Author plus means this author element might, this article element might have multiple author elements, at least one or more author elements, right? And here you can see this text has section element, right? So in front of this section element, you can see star or asterisk. So it says content of the text element may contain 0 or more section elements in this position, right? So content of the section element, content of the text element may contain 0 or more. So plus means 1 or more, asterisk means 0 or more, right? So these are the things that you have to remember. So here it says declaration types. So PC data means past character data. Child means one child element, right? So C1, if it is defined like this, that means multiple sequence of child elements. So plus means 1 or more, asterisk means 0 or more, question mark means 0 or none, right? You have to make sure that you remember these things, right? And also there can be elements with mixed content. That means sometimes the element might have past character data as well as indexes, sites, glossary, multiple types, right? Mixed contents. And then there can be elements with empty content, right? And elements with arbitrary content. That means nothing, there can be any kind of elements. We don't know what, there can be any, right? So it is arbitrary content. So there can be elements like this also, but this is not being used at production level. That means it is not used in production level environment. Right? And now we discussed till here about elements. Now apart from elements, we have attributes. Right? Attributes means some sort of string defined within a tag. Right? So here we define attributes with ATT list or attribute list tag. Right? So attribute list and the section, number, and required. Right? So yes, like this. So this is the element name. This attribute list is applicable for applicable for section element, right? And this is the attribute name, and this is the attribute type. And attribute is by default it is required, right? So here we define the attribute tag with att list tag, and then we have this what you call the section, and yes, and then we have the attribute name which is number, and attribute type character data, right? And it is required. So in this case we have defined two required attributes for element section. So element is section. These are the two attributes, number and title. And the data type used in these are character data, that means any kind of data, and then these are required by default, right? So possible attribute defaults, that means this required type values, right? If it is required, that means this is required in each element instance. Whenever you try to use this section element, you have to have number element and the title element. That is what it says. Implied means it is optional. That means you can use or you cannot use, right? Fixed means it should have this default value in it by default, right? Default has this default value if the attribute is omitted from the element instance, right? So if there is no attribute in the element, this default value will be assigned to that particular element. That is what it says, right? So if you go through this again, if you want to define now, yes, this way you define elements. If you want to define attributes for a particular element, you can use att list section, att list this tag, right? And then immediately after att list followed by and space, you are defining the element name, which is section, and then the attribute name, which is number, and the data type, which is C data, that means character data, and the default value, which is required. That means required means that is definitely you should include this number in each time that when you are using the section element, right? And apart from that, here you have the title attribute also in the same section, right? So the section is the section element, and this element should have both of these number and title elements by default, right? Apart from that, you can see these values are required. These values are the attribute defaults, right? So this is the default. Required, which is required in each element instance. Implied means it is optional. Fixed means always has this default values, whatever the default value we have mentioned, right? Attribute types in DTDs. So there can be multiple attribute types. So for the moment we discuss about C data. Apart from C data, we have multiple. C data means string data, right? And if there are multiple types that is possible, multiple data types that is possible, you can define it like this within brackets with this what you call the this mark, right? And then if it is ID, that means it should be a unique XML name identify the element, right? So instead of C data, if we use ID here, this ID attribute should contain a unique value, right? Now, it should be unique value if you use ID, right? So ID reference, that means it should contain a link to some other attributes ID element, right? So as an example, you can see it here. So attribute list publication, right? So the type is either journal or in proceeding. Right? It's publication ID. Pub ID is Publication is an ID. That means it should be unique, and that is required, right? Attributed site ID, it is ID reference. It is then again required, right? So you can see it here. So publication has type. The type is either journal or in proceedings. So here it is journal, right? And the publication ID, it is unique. That means this publication ID, become one. This publication ID can only be used in this publication element. And the element may ID use currently. If you are defining another publication, you have to use another unique ID like this, right? And then the site ID. Site ID is a reference to another element, right? So site ID is referencing XML 98, that is this second publication, right? So likewise, this is how you use attributes. So you can see it here. Type journal, which is, it can be either title, journal, or in proceedings. So in here, the first publication, you can see it is journal, and in the second publication, it is in proceedings. So it should be either journal or in proceedings. You can't use anything other than this, right? Here, the site ID refers this one. Right? Site ID use. So that means it is referring another one. So you can see it here. ID ref means reference to IT attribute of some other element. So this site ID refers this element. And here the citation ID refers another public. Right? So ref means it is referring some other one. So it is defined here. Right? ID ref means it is referencing the ID of some other element in the XML document. Right? So now we have learned how to define XML DTD for elements as well as attributes. Now we should know how to link these DTDs to your XML documents, right? XML document DTD. There can be multiple DTDs. As an example, let's say you are using CSS file when you are developing a website, right? As an example. So likewise, when you are developing the CSS file, you are developing the HTML file in another place, CSS file in another place, and then you are linking it with this style. Using link tag, right? In the same way, you can or you have to define the DTD for a particular XML document, right? So doc type is article, and you should refer article.dtd or article.document type definition, right? So in the beginning of or at the start of an XML document, we have to define what is the DTD that we are going to refer for this particular XML document. So doc type and system are keywords, right? And article is the root element in the DTD as well as in our document, right? And this is the link or the URI for the DTD, right? Apart from that, now there are two ways to include or link DTDs. So as an example, if you are using CSS also, you have three ways. You can have inline, internal, and external. So this is the external way, right? If you are defining XML DTD outside of the document, this is how we are going to link it, right? If you're using external DTD. As well, you can use internal DTDs, right? So in this case, you are defining the DTD internally, and then you are going to have the XML document, right? So this is external, this is the internal method, right? And both this can be mixed up. Internal EDD overrides external entity information, right? So you can use both internal and external, but you have to remember, if the same information is defined in both internal and external, priority is given to the internal one, right? එකම දේ නම් internal එක external එකේ දෙකෙන් තියෙන්නේ priority එක දෙන්නේ internal එකට, right? So before going forward, we have to do some sort of practicals, okay? Right. I hope you can see the screen. Pen on it.
ThariHasa.
So how do you start the XML document? HTML like nam patan ganne, type HTML, right? So how do you start XML document? You start with this question mark with the opening tag and XML, then you have to define the version. So here I'm using XML version 1.0, right? So this is how you start the XML document, right? And I'm saying this as first.xml, right? So the formatting has been applied. Let's take that article example. Here we have the article, right? Article tag. And this article has what? The title of the article. Title of the article is, let's say, COVID-19, right? And then we have author of the article. මට chat එකේ මුලින්ම පේන නම ගන්නවා. Right, so the author is Dilsha, right? And then the what? Date. It is today's date. And then the description of the article. So there can be many lines like this, many paragraphs. So this is the description of the article, right? And there can be another article like this, right? So once this is defined, if you want to validate this article, if it is correct or not, right? You can simply go to this site I defined, I sent you on the chat, xmlvalidation.com, and go here and click on validate. So it will say no errors were found, right? So there are no errors in that particular document, right? And then the next part. But now you have to define the DTD, right? Document type definition. So you know this is very flexible. මෙතන ඕන තැනකට ඕන ආටිකල් එකක් ඔබන්න පුළුවන්. කිසිම ප්‍රශ්නයක් නැහැ. කවුරුත් මුකුත් කියන්නේ නැහැ. Right? You can use anything in here. But the problem is, now if I'm using a particular field, as an example, let's say now This is a mobile application, right? So what I'm developing is a mobile application. In the mobile application, this is a news mobile app, right? When you open the mobile application, you can see the news, right? So the backend server is in somewhere else. Backend server is on some other website, right? Or some other web server, right? From that web server only, we get the news feed, right? As a feed, we get the news, right? So what happens here is when the application opens, application send a request to the web server saying, send me the latest news. So the web server send the latest news to you, right? And your application knows only a particular text, article, title, author, date, description, මේ text එක විතරයි ඔයගොල්ලන්ගේ application එක දාන්නේ. If the web server sends this information with some other set of tags or some other set of XML documents or some other undefined XML documents, will your mobile application be able to grab what is inside this XML document? What is delivered through this XML document? No, right? අපි මේ define කරපු එක අපි අපේ application එකට තේරෙන XML file එකක් නෙවෙයි නම් අරහෙන් යවන්නේ. We don't know how to process that. So in that case, if we define a particular format for our XML document, if we can define a DTD, we can overcome this problem, right? So if the web server knows what is the DTD and if our mobile application also knows what is the DTD, then that means there's a compatibility. So they know the vocabulary or they know the standard. So there is some sort of standard in this flexible language. So to overcome this, we have to define what you call this DTD, document type definition. So to define the document type definition, first we have to define the doc type and the root element's name. The root element's name is article. Right? And it ends from here. Then we have to start defining the elements. So the first element is, as you can see, the first element is what? Article. Right? And this article contains these four elements: author, title, author, date, and description. Right. So as I told you earlier, there can be multiple authors. Let's assume that this one document is written by many authors, right? So we use author class. And then the date. So the first element is done. Make a high. Then what we have? We have the element type. Then again it is, there is no sub elements, it is PC data. Right. Then again we have the next element, which is date. That is again PC data. Then we have element description. That is again PC data. Right? So that's it. This is the DTD for this particular XML document. So we can test it in our XML element. Let's see whether it gives any errors. Right? No errors were found. Right? That means this document validates against this DTD. Right? That means we are in the standard. Right? So let's see if අපි මේකට තව මොකක් හරි එකක් දානවා. මේකට අපි තව එලිමන්ට් එකක් දානවා link කියලා. So here I'm using some another one called link, right? Which is not defined in the DTD. Right. So it returns this error. Right. So element type link must be declared. Right. Like this. So that means there's a error.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Sir, this is a time for our fasting. Can we take a little break?
Sure.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Right. So does anyone have any questions regarding this one? XML validation or using DTD? Any questions? Sorry, there's a little error here. We have missed the author. Do you have any questions with regard to this one? Right. There's another error. Can anyone tell me what is the error by looking at this document?
Author plus?
Author plus is okay. Author plus means at least one or more. So one is here. One author is already here. Right, do this in your own computer. Yes, I got one answer, and that is a direct message. That is correct. I can't see the name. Yes, The answer you sent me is correct. Right. So what I'll suggest you is you do this in your own computer now, right? While connected to the Zoom call, right? And let me know what is the feedback. You can do this. Right. Make codes normally work I have written enough codes during my academic and even after in the industry. So you have to write this. Assignment that's why. If you have any question, you can ask.
සර් ඔතන යාර වෙබ් එකට දාලා තිබ්බ එතන කෝඩ් එක පොඩ්ඩක් පෙන්නන්න පුළුවන්ද? මොකද ඇදලා ගත්තේ.
වෙබ් එකේ දාලා කෝඩ් එක කියන්නේ මේකද? This one?
නෑ හරි.
So what you have to do is you have to write the code in your Notepad++ or whatever IDE you are using, and you have to paste it in that that particular website.
Yes.
Now this is a very basic one, very basic one. So in the future you will have much more advanced things to do. Before that, I want you to do this. If anyone gets the correct, make error එක fix කරොත් මට chat එකේ direct message එකක් දාන්න, not to everyone, direct message to me. I'll give you another 5 minutes. Actually, I was planning to do these sessions in a lab, not like this. This is not much successful. But we are not going to do this. We can't do that for another long time, I guess. Guys, all are well ned. No one is infected with COVID, any quarantine center or anything like that. All are doing good, ne?
අපේ කෙනෙක් ඉන්නවා සෝදනට.
කවුද ඉන්නේ?
හිමන්ත වණ්ඩාර කියලා කෙනෙක් ලක්ගල හොස්පිටල් එකේ. පොසිටිව්.
කොයිද හොස්පිටල් එක?
ලග්ගල හොස්පිටල් එක.
මොකද complications නැහැ නේ නිකන්.
නෑ දැන් නම් එහෙම ලොකු අවුලක් නෑ කිව්වා.
There are 2 COVID infected persons in my department at office. There are no ICUs, no hospitals, nothing. They are staying at home.
Yes, sir. It's very bad situation.
Yes, very bad situation. So what you can do is you can wear masks, use sanitizers every time possible, and stay at home. That's the only thing that you can do. So anyone found the solution for the error? The error is root element is not well formed. That is the error that we are getting here. Anyone found the solution for the error? I know one person, yes, one person has found the error. I'll give you another 2 minutes and then I'll explain. Yes, same data input. Right. So a couple of persons have found the solution. So the problem here is article is the root element, right? So in Excel, in this DTD, article is the root element, right? So root element means there can be only one root element in a particular XML document. As we learned in last week, there can be only one root element in a particular what you call XML document, right? So in that case, you have to change this to another root element, because there are multiple root elements. So article is the root element, but there are two article elements here, as you can see. So what you can do is, you can change this maybe to book, right? And then define another element at the beginning, like this. So if you validate this now, it will say that you have to change the root element. I have changed the root element. So inside book, there can be multiple or one or more articles, right? Yes, this one now. You can see that. Yes, it validates, right? Now I can see there are no errors here. Right, understood everyone? හැමෝටම තේරුණාද? Did everyone understand? So if you don't understand, you can always send me a message or just unmute your microphone and tell. මොකක්ද අවුල කියලා තේරුණාද හැමෝටම?
තේරුණා සර්.
Right. Right. Okay. So I hope that everyone understand this. And the next thing I want you to define the attribute, which is ID. So here the ID is 1. Here the ID is 2. This ID attribute should be unique for each article, right? This ID attribute should be unique for each article. I want you to write what is the DTD for this ID attribute. Right? I'm not going to write it. Should be a unique one. ID is unique. Can you do that? And send the code line, just a single code line like this. Send it to me via the chat. You know what to do, right? Understood, right?
Hello, sir. Sir, hello. Sir,
Yes.
I කියන්නකෝ මට තේරුන්නේ නැහැ.
All right. So what you have to do is, here you have this, each and every article has an attribute called ID, right? So this ID attribute is unique for each element. So article 1 has ID 1, article 2 has ID 2. If there is an article called article 3, it has ID 3. That is unique for each article. right? So I want you to write the DTD for this ID attribute, right? Elements are done. I want you to write the DTD for ID attribute. You can find how to write on the lecture material I said, or the one we did before a couple of minutes. The only thing is ID should be unique. Fair enough?
Oh, sir.
Right. And that is a required attribute. That means every time the article is there, the ID attribute should also be there. That is a required one. So if you can't find how to write this, you may refer slide number 39 on the lecture material I sent today. You can refer the slide number 39. Right. So I think no one can find the way to do this. This is the element. Element is article, and the attribute is ID. And it should be unique, so that is an ID, and it is required. To avoid confusions, I rename this to article ID. So here you can see it is attribute, element is article, attribute is article ID. ID means here, ID means that should be unique. That means you can't have same article ID for two article elements. Article ID article elements use and it is required. Right. So if you validate this, you can see that there is no error. Right? Got it done?
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Sir, मैं वो syntax का मामा मैं validate करा देगा error का क्या नाम है?
ABC1 to ABC1 ABC2 के उदाहरण हमारे XML validators और या वो लेना XML grammar के इगलो text type में तो ID को पास करने देने दे रहा है. sometimes XML expect that we will send mixed type of characters, just not just numbers. Right? You will eventually you will learn what is that. The next section is XSD, XML schema definitions. So in that section you will learn what is that. For now, just use some mixed approach like this. I'm all right, ne? If you use the same value for both one, yes. Still you are getting errors or what? No, no, okay. Yes, when you try with the same value, ABC1 for both, you will get an error that ID should be unique. Right, understood everyone? Any questions? Right, going forward, we will do some advanced example. This one. You have to write the DTD for this example. Can you? Write the DTD for this example. I'll give you like 5 to 10 minutes maximum. Let's see whether you can do this.
සර් ඒක තෙර එකක් එනවා සර්.
මොකක්ද නේද ඒක?
ඒකේ මේ පෙන්වන්නේ මේ එලිමන්ට් බුක් ආටිකල් කියන එකෙන් තමයි පෙන්වන්නේ. සර් මම ඉන්ඩෙක්ස් එකක් දුන්නොත් පුළුවන්ද කොහොමද?
What is the error? Error message එක මොකක්ද පෙන්වන්නේ කියලා?
එලිමන්ට් බුක් ආටිකල් කියලා තමයි පෙන්වන්නේ.
දැන් copy කරලා paste කරන්න chat එකේ error message එක.
hello sir. hello.
Yes.
අනේ සර් මගේ ලැප් එක වැඩ නැහැ. මේක මේ සර්ට කොපියක් chat එකට දාන්න පුළුවන්ද? එතකොට මට edit කරලා මේ එවන්න පුළුවන් නේ chat එකේ. ෆෝන් එකෙන් එන්නේ සර් lecture.
Right, okay. Hold on. You want the second one, right? This one, ne?
Yes
ඔව්
sir.
සර් දැන් කරන්න දුන්නේ ඔතන.
I can upload the right. I'll send you this. In the meantime, I will upload the file as well. Laptop se engineer getting the file like that. Right. Calling example like file එකත් මම දානවා දැන් chat එකට. Article කියන එක. you find any error, just let me know. Right, article plus error, that error. See whether you have any spelling mistakes, because this validates fine on my computer. The only thing that can happen is if it is an error like this, you might have some spelling mistakes or missing tags or something like that. Just see whether everything is correct. Right. So this is the second one that you have to do. You have to write the DTD for this one. So I will take the start for you. Error එක වෙනවා. මම මේ file එක upload කරලා බලන්න ඒකේ error එක වෙනවද කියලා. If you are getting the same error.
නෑ සර් කියන්නේ.
That means there can be some mistake. මොකක් හරි mistake එකේ දෙක line එක හරි. චුට්ටක් බලන්න. බලන්න එකපාරට ඒක පේන්නේ error හැංගිලා තියෙනවා. Maybe a single letter. Oh, XML is case sensitive. That also you have to take into consideration. That means if it is simple, it means something else. If it is capital, it means another thing. Right, I will take the start for you. Now start the current then so we have to define the doc type initially, which is the root element, which is the ship order. Right? And you are ending the DTD. You're starting the DTD like this, and you are ending the DTD like this. Whatever things that you are defining, it should be inside this thing. Right, and there's an attribute called order ID also. Order ID attribute you have to take that also into consideration. Once you are done, you can send me the XML file itself. You are an XML file. Right, I'm getting few answers saying that you are getting errors. You have to be careful with the spellings of these keywords like element and attribute list, likewise, right? So if the spelling is incorrect, that means definitely you're going to get errors. Right, so enough time, let's do this. So I might also make mistakes. So tell me if you find out any mistake that I'm making. So element ship order, which is the root element, it has order person, ship to, and many items. One or many items. Plus means one or many items. Right? And this element has this attribute called order ID. Order ID, shipboard element has order ID and it has character data which is required. So I'm not using unique here, or I could have used ID here. Sorry, yes, ID here, but I'm not using ID here because it should not be unique. Like a unique pen only because there's only one node ID. So you can use simply C data. Right? And then we have order person, which is pass character data. We have ship2. Ship2 has 4 child elements, which are name, address, city, and country. Right. Then we have sub-elements of ship2, which is first one is name, again PC data. Second one is address, again PC data. Third one is element, third element is city, which is again PC data. And the country, which is again PC data. Right? So we are done up to this place. Now we have item. Right? Element item has 4. Right? So by seeing this item element, you can see there are 4 attributes. First one is title, second one is node. And there's a small problem here because this node is not there in the second item element. The node is only there on the first element. That means it is 1, 0 or 1. Let's assume 0 or 1. There can be 0 or 1 not able. So the question mark. Then quantity and the price. Then we have item, which is a sub-element of items. Again, PC data. We have not again PC data. Then we have the quantity, which is again pass character data. And then we have the price, which is again PC data. So this is it. Right, so let me validate this one. Yes, there's an error here. I have missed this closing bracket. Let's see. Yes, now no errors. So this is the correct one. Orders.xml, the DTD for orders.xml, right? So I'll send you this file also. Orders.xml. Sorry, which intended to. Right. So do you understand this DTD process now? DTD process එක තේරෙනවද ඔක්කොටම? Everyone? You have to speak up.
So question mark එක දැම්මේ
Question mark එකක් දාන්නේ 0 or 1 කියන එක. ඒ කියන්නේ none or 1 කියන එක. ඒ කියන්නේ තියෙන්න පුළුවන් නැති වෙන්න පුළුවන් optional කියන එක. I did that because here items, in items you can see in the first item you have this not element, but in the second one you don't have this not element. That means the not is definitely optional. That means 0 or 1. So here not is 0 or 1. There can be a not or there cannot be. Right?
okay sir.
Any more questions? Did everyone understand what we did here?
hello sir
Yes. Yeah.
order id කිහිපයක් තියෙනකොට
Order ID කීපයක් තියෙනවා. In this case, there will be no multiple order IDs because the root element is the order itself. So if we are having multiple orders, to have multiple order IDs, you need to have multiple orders. So you need a different root element. So ship order කෙනෙක් root element එකට ගන්න බෑ. Ship order ගේ elements එක කීප පාරක් තියෙනවා. එතකොට we have to get something else. If you have multiple order IDs and if you want that order IDs to be unique, each order ID is a unique one, then you have to use ID instead of C data here. Right? That means the ID should be, it validates whether the ID is unique in each ship order element. Right? Fair enough?
oh sir
Any more questions? If you don't have any more questions, I think we can move ahead to the next example. One more example and we are done with detail. Right. So I assume you don't have any more questions. One more order that, one more example, which is the inverse of what we have done so far. Right, so I hope you can see this. I want you to write the XML code for this sample XML codes for this DTD. Natural XML code is DTD, but in this case you have to write the XML codes for this provided DTD. Right, I'm sending you the file. And so what you have to do is you have to write the XML elements for this DTD. XML elements here, starting from the root element.
sir copy එකක් දානවා chat එකට sir
So you will ඔයාලට මෙන්න මෙතනදී පොඩි ප්‍රශ්නයක් එයි. Here you have two values separated by this mark, right? So we did while I explain this what is this mark says. So here what it means is there can be elements, sub-elements under this stock root element which is new car or used car, right? So make sub-elements තියෙන්න පුළුවන්, new car කියලා තියෙන්න පුළුවන්, used car කියලා තියෙන්න පුළුවන්, and there can be multiple sub-elements, right? Star says multiple, right? So it can either be a new car sub-element or used car sub-element. Right? So if it is new car, you have only model and price sub-elements. If it is used car, you have model, price, mileage, and condition sub-elements. Right? And the condition is optional here. Right. I got some answers from the chat. So enough time. Let's see how this happens. Right. So the root element is stock. As you can see here, the root element is stock. And under stock, there can be new cars and used cars. So let's go with new car. So under new car, you can see there is the model, and the price. So the model is, let's say model is, or the price is right, and then there is used car. Used car, right? So it can be either new car or used car. So used cars have then again 4 sub-elements. One is optional. The condition is optional. So result, and price is price, and we have mileage, then we have the condition which is optional. There can be another used car element without this condition. So without this condition, as the condition is optional, right? So this is it. Does everyone understand? Sorry.
Yes.
Right. So I think now you understand how DTD and XML works, and you have a good idea about XML, right? Am I correct? XML ගැන හොඳ idea එකක් තියෙනවනේ.
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. So moving forward, we read up to here. Flaws of DTD or disadvantages of DTD. Right. So we learned how to use DTD and how to use validators, how to use attribute lists, everything we did, right? So there are some disadvantages of DTD. So we have to understand those, right? No support for basic data types like integers, doubles, dates, times, etc. Right? So even though we define PC data and C data, we can't define what is the data type that we expect. Right? So when it comes to data types, we have date time data type, we have integer data type, we have float data type, we have string data type, we have many data types, right? But in DTDs, we can't define what is the data type that we are expecting. We can define only whether it is past character data. So that can either be floating point numbers, integers, strings, anything. We can't define what exactly we are looking for, right? We can't define what is the basic, even what is even the basic data type like integers, doubles, dates, times, those things, right? So that is a definite disadvantage, right? No structured self-definable data types, right? So data types and everything is predefined. We can't define anything by ourselves, by our own data types, right? No type derivations, right? ID, IDR reference links are quite loose. Target is not specified, right? So you can't specify this, right? So as a solution for these flaws in DTD or disadvantages in DTD, we have another solution called XML schema, right? A replacement or something else that is more improved than DTD, right? So let's go ahead with XML schema. Right. Okay. So XML schema is an XML application. Provides simple types. So it provides simple data types, string, integer, date, time, duration, language. Allows defining possible values for elements. Allows defining types derived from existing types. Allows defining complex types. Allows forcing constraints on the occurrence of elements, right? So it allows forcing uniqueness and foreign keys, right? So this is way too complex to cover in this kind of introductory topic. And introduction level again, so this is too complex. So XML schema basically has everything that you need to develop a production level application, right? A complete, let's say you're developing an ERP solution. XML schema has everything you require, right? Data types, complex types, constraints, uniqueness and foreign keys, everything you have, right? So this is a simple XML schema, right? So you can define the element name, data types, title, data types, sequences, everything, right? So this is the next thing that we are going to do, right? XML schema, right? So let's see XML schema now. Right, XML schema. So during our previous sessions, we learned about these things, right? XML as inheriting from the web history, right? The introduction of XML, HTML, and those things. XML key concepts, documents, elements, attributes, etc. And the ordering and nesting of XML and namespaces, XML usage scenarios, DTDs and describing the structure of an XML file. These things we already completed, right? So now what we will do is XML schema. Right. So here again we are discussing about the limitations of XML or XML DTDs. DTDs describe only the grammar of the XML file, not the detailed structure and or types, right? So XML describes only the grammar, only the vocabulary, only the basic structure, not the detailed structure of the XML document, right? This grammatical description has some obvious shortcomings. So definitely we have this obvious shortcomings with this XML right. Yes, I'll send this presentation to your emails right after the session. I'm not going to cover many things in this session because we did a lot. You will not be able to grasp everything. So I see. Right. So moving forward. So we have these disadvantages. We cannot express the length of element must contain non-negative numbers, right? Right. So we have, so you can see we have these shortcomings. So when it comes to XML schema, we have these things, complex and simple types, right? So complex types correspond to record, simple type is string, right? So in here, complex types means we can define our own data types, right? As an example, let's say items in the order. So there can be many item categories, right? So if we go to an e-commerce site, we can see many categories: women's clothes, men's clothes, baby items, like so we can define a complex type for that, right? So if it is a simple element, let's say the name of a particular element, that is a string, that is a simple type, right? And then we have built-in and user-defined types. Complex types are always user-defined. Elements have complex types or simple types. Attributes have simple types, right? So this is example scheme. So as an example here, you can see that this here, the type is complex, book type. The type is book type. It is complex. Here the type is string. That is simple. Right? So we are going to learn these things in detail in coming weeks. I don't think we have much time to complete these things today. So anyway, before going forward with these things, so do you have any questions from the items that we did today? Any questions? Right. So when it comes to XML schema definitions, you can see a good tutorial in W3 schools, right? here. Right, so even you can go back to a DTD and do some exercises on W3 schools. So XML, you can see what is the XML schema. Right, so there's a question. If an element has multiple attributes, then how to define it in DTD? Right, good question. All right. Let's go to this example again. Right. Let's say yes. Let's say you have multiple ones here. So you have remind me some sort of if you have heavy thundering, you can disconnect. I'll upload the recorded session. I'm recording this one. I'll upload this to Google Drive and share it with you. If you have a heavy thundering and rain, you can disconnect. That's all right. I'll upload this one. I got a message saying that there are heavier thundering in your areas. So if you have any heavy rain and heavy thundering, you can disconnect. I'm recording this session, so I'll upload this to the Google Drive and share with you. You can disconnect. Right. So can anyone suggest me an attribute to include here? Method and attribute is suggest right? Article ID होगा तब
Article type.
Yes, article type. Let's say ABC or XYZ. So if you want to define another attribute here, you can simply and the data type. Let's say C data. And this is required. Right. So if this is not required, this is optional, you can use implied here. That means it is not mandatory to have this article type element in every attribute in every element, right? You can define it like this. Or else, what you can do is, this is also correct. Right? You can define it as a brand new attribute list, or you can include it in the same one, like this. Okay. Any more questions like that? Right. So I will come to this place, which is XSD definitions. Right. So you can see the complete XML schema tutorial in WP schools. We are going to do visit much more complex examples in coming weeks. So once we have completed this XML schema, then we can go ahead with XPath and XQL. So in the meantime, since we did what you call XML and DTD, I'll show you how the REST APIs work with JSON, right? So this is how the SOAP APIs work with XML. Now I will show you how JSON ones work and why JSON is always better than what you call XML, right? So this is something additional to your syllabus, but this is very important to you. So let's take this example, right? So the example is articles, right? You can see the screen, right? You can see the screen, right? Everyone?
Yes, sir.
So let's take this example itself. So instead of this, I'm creating a new file. It is called article.json. Right, so this is a JSON file. So here, what are the elements we have? Article. Right, so we have article ID here. Sorry, we have the book here. Sorry. We have the book here. Inside the book, we have articles. Right? So inside the book, we have articles. We have article ID ABC1. Then we have title of the article is COVID-19 in Sri Lanka. And then we have letter colors. Let me change the colors then. You can see this because of this white color, right? I hope now you can see this. And the author, let's say this. And the date, you can define the date like this. And also description like this. Right? And remember, you have to define each of these things in quotation marks if it is JSON. Now we were discussing about XML. Now this is JSON, right? So let's say you have another article. Simply place a comma and add the next article, and the third article you can do it like this, right? So this is how you represent the same XML document that we did for the first time in JSON, right? So there are two types of APIs. First one is SOAP APIs, which consumes XML, and the second type is JSON APIs, which consumes RESTful web services or REST APIs. So in the industry, the last used type is JSON now. At the moment, JSON is the most widely used one. So if you're using JSON, you have the flexibility of using it like this. There is no validation, there is no parsing, there's nothing, right? You just get the item from here, from the data server or the API, and display it in your web application, just like this, right? So this is the element name, this is the value, and there is no attributes, right? So in XML we have elements and attributes, but in JSON we have only elements. In here we call them objects. So article ID is the object, right? And this object can have another sub object. As an example, this author if there are multiple authors, let's say author has multiple authors, it can be something like this. It might have multiple authors, right? So right, and there can be another author here. Right, so as you can see, JSON is very flexible and it consumes very small amount of text, right? The XML එක compare කරපුවා මේකට use කරන්නේ ගොඩක් අඩු text lines ප්‍රමාණය. Very small number of text lines are being used at in JSON when you compare this with XML like this. So XML, there's a huge number of characters. So what are the advantages of using JSON instead of XML? Why this JSON is much more popular in the industry now? Because it consumes much lesser amount of data. So the communication process is much faster. So when it comes to chat messages, notifications, everything, JSON is now the platform, even in Facebook, Google, everywhere. Right? So this is something additional for you, other than what we are learning till now. So do you have any questions now? No questions still on that. Right. So do you have any questions from what we did today? Or anything related to IT? Any questions? No. So if you have any questions, you can ask now. Because we don't have much time to start the next topic.
assignment එක next week.
Assignment එකෙන් මෙහෙමයි assignment එක දෙන්න මේ class lecture session එක වෙලා කරන්න නෙමෙයි, but I'm giving you something that you can do and submit. එහෙම නැත්නම් class වෙලා තියෙන එකක් නෙමෙයි. You have to do some sort of XML related thing and you have to submit. අනිත් modules වල assignments දීලා තින්නේ. Yes or no? අනිත් subjects වල
subject 3ක විතර දුන්නා සර් අපිට.
right. Okay. ඔයගොල්ලන්ගේ කලින් semester exams උත් තාම තිබ්බේ නෑ නේද?
නෑ සර් මේ තාම නෑ.
අවසන් දවසට තියන්න වෙන්නේ නැහැ යන විදිහට එක්කන.
ඔව් සර් online තිබ්බොත් තමයි.
online මම දැක්කේ නෑ කිසිම government university එකකට කරනවා. chartered institute එකේ එහෙම කරලා තිබ්බා. වෙන කොහෙවත් මම දැක්කේ නෑ online. NSBM එක කරලා තිබ්බා government නම් මම මොකුත්ම දැක්කේ නෑ තාම. not even in Moratuan UCSC. මම දැක්කේ නෑ කරලා නැහැ. I haven't seen.
තව assignment එකක් තියෙනවා සර් 4ක් විතර practical එක.
Practical level. Right. So you might have practical exam assignments in this one also, but like a lab game I can give it to you as take-home assignments. As an example, first some theoretical, you have to cover some theoretical parts with assignments. What do you report that came you from the first 3 sessions by DVD that architectures, software service oriented architecture and those things, entire architecture, those things you have one assignment. And with WSDL websites and from those things one assignment. And from XML you have to do around yes, then again 1 or 2 assignments. And then you have to develop a web service. That might be a group assignment. Those are the assignments that you have in this module. So it's like this, you have 70% of marks from the exam, 30% from the assignments. That's how in this module it goes. So you have to get 30% marks from the assignments and the 70% from the exam. ඔයගලන්ට පාස් පේපර්ස් එහෙම හම්බෙලා තියෙනවද?
නෑ සර් ගන්න බැරි වුණා අපි second semester එකේ විතරයි ගන්න හම්බුනේ.
ලයිබ්‍රරි එකේ දෙනවද නේ? තියෙනවද?
ඔව් සර් ලයිබ්‍රරි එකෙන් ගන්න පුළුවන්.
Right. Then shall we stop the session for the day? We have done a lot today, practicals and all. So if you have any questions before stopping the session related to this subject or anything related to maybe IT related questions. Any suggestions to the session? Make a suggestions or practicals are there.
කරන විදිය නම් හොඳයි සර්.
Let me know if there's anything that I can improve on from my side that you don't understand, or if you think that if you can if I can improve in this side, then just let me know.